Hello and welcome to Unspeakable Depths, a podcast on creative peace building. Throughout these episodes, I'll be exploring different projects, bringing an artistic approach to conflict transformation, and speaking with the people who work on them. Let's jump right in with our guest for this episode.
Okay, I'm Kim Berman. I have a couple of affiliations. I'm a professor of visual arts at the University of Johannesburg, and I've been so for over 27 years. I'm also a founding director of Artist Proof Studio, which is a community arts center that I started with a co-founder, Untitled Chapter, in 1990. So we're 30 years old this year. And so my work and my practice has been linked to community arts and social change.
How did you get involved with that type of work and kind of like set your life path on, I'm gonna use visual arts and social change together?
That's visual arts and social change has been a life path. How did I get started? Well, I started as a student at Wits University at the time in the 90s, where there was a very active anti-apartheid movement. So I was very politically engaged, and my art, I was an art student, so I used my art in the sort of political activism at the time as a student. Students sort of at Wits in the early 80s, in fact, late 70s, was the beginning of the state of emergency in South Africa. So there was a lot of repression going on. In South Africa, students were being arrested, lots of images banned. We had I joined a silkscreen collective where we were printing posters for announcing meetings, but put them up at midnight, and by the morning they were ripped off by the security police. So all meetings were banned, all political organizations was banned. So there was a lot of activism that kind of happened underground, but using print media. And so I was a printmaker, and my work was very, very kind of political. And then in 1983, I left the country. My sister actually fled the country in exile, and because of her political activities, I chose to go and ended up spending 7 years in Boston. I joined the ANC in exile. I was at the Museum School of Fine Arts and Tufts University. I joined the ANC, I joined the anti-apartheid movement, and worked in the anti-apartheid movement abroad. So I guess my art has been linked to my political activism. And then, and so that was my pathway. I returned to South Africa in 1990 when Mandela was freed, and he kind of called on all South Africans abroad to come back and help build a democracy. And I heeded that call and came back in 1990.
And how did that turn into like what you do today?
Yeah, I think in 1990, it was a very, very exciting time for South Africa. Mandela was released. There was a CODESA. People were writing a new constitution, a new Bill of Rights. There was a preparation for becoming a democracy in South Africa. So all of the Freedom Charter and all the hopes and dreams of people to have equity and justice, it was in a very, very exciting time. I was also involved in the gay rights movement. I left South Africa with my then partner and came back, and in 1990, there was the very first gay rights parade in Africa. And in the first meeting, most people, obviously gay rights were at that time banned, and it was very risky. So the first march, people marched with bags over their heads to disguise them. But I think I was at the time in a very different position, able to be back and forth. I went back and forth to America to teach summer school for a couple of years. So when I came back, I met Nhlanhla Ngaba, who is an artist who was a member of the Black Consciousness Movement, but he was a member of the Funda Community Center in Soweto. And my mom had an art gallery and introduced me to a bunch of artists. I'd been out of the country for 7 years, so I've lost touch with that community. And so he brought in a lot of artists and joined me in this dream to start a cooperative studio. So when I was in Boston, I worked as a printer in a studio called Artist Proof, which was a studio in Cambridge. Then moved to Somerville called Mix It Studio. So I trained as a printer. I was an apprentice for 6 years working as a printer, and decided then that this is something I wanted to do in South Africa, because there wasn't such a thing. There wasn't a cooperative. And this notion of having a cooperative studio that would be accessible to all was something very new. And so that was the way I kind of understood my activism, or ways of realizing how to make the kind of privileges and skills that I obtained during my apprenticeship and education, and while I was doing my master's in Boston, how to transfer those skills and share them with people who have been deprived of skills. So we opened Artist Proof Studio, and Nhlanhla and I, and opened it to artists to come and learn, and we taught and realized that none of the artists had money to pay, so we couldn't quite keep it going. So I then joined the university and taught, was then at Technicon, and I taught and earned enough money to pay Nhlanhla to teach at the studio, and then we worked at night. We offered classes, and so that's, in the early years of when, leading up to 94, South Africa had its first democratic election. We were very involved with trying to figure out what is democratic participation, what does it mean? And we participated in some amazing projects where we did the murals and large work for the first legislatures. The Gauteng legislature is a building around the corner from where we were in the inner city, and we made collaborative artworks where artists came together and made a single work on themes of democracy, and themes of economic justice and environmental justice and equality. And so artists worked together as a group in printmaking, and we explored the notion of collaboration and democracy. And it was mostly Artist Proof mostly then became an organization that had the philosophy of being accessible to all, whether they had education or not. And it remains today. We've lasted 30 years and still nobody pays fees. We attract students who are highly talented, very skilled, but don't have the education or the finances. We do have a fee-paying program as well, but most of our students are on scholarship in a way, because our philosophy is to keep the doors open for access if you're talented and have the kind of ability. So that's, I think, how we started, and that's how we started our philosophy at the time. Looking at, and in that way, we really understood the meaning of how art can really create social change, because many of our graduates at Artist Proof Studio are able to find a living. and be self-supporting and self-sustaining.
In peace and conflict studies, we try to unpack an understanding of violence as not just like physical violence. And I feel like with a lot of social change and social justice type activists, you kind of understand that after a while, but maybe just the general public doesn't. So like there's the violence of oppression, like emotional violence, mental violence, all of that. So could you maybe explain to someone from the outside, very briefly, just like what are the types of violence? What is the experience of violence that the people in South Africa have had over the past, I'll say like 40 years?
Yeah, I think South Africa has a very, very, very violent history and legacy and past. And I think the violence of discrimination, the violence of apartheid has damaged the psyche, has damaged people's sense of themselves in the world. I think that it's such a, I mean, we the capital in the world of violent crime, of domestic violence, of violence against women and children, of road accidents and road rage, of alcohol abuse, of armed robbery, of murders. I think we top of the pops with all of these things because we're such a violent nation. I think they're, and yet at the same time we're a nation that's also about Ubuntu and humanity and the ability to be and understand and be human. So you have this strange kind of alliance of living in absolute, polarities of awful poverty and awful violence, and people who are that poor. And I guess we also have patriarchy. So, with a colonial past and colonial violence to this nation, I mean, it runs deep. I think oppression runs deep, discrimination runs deep, and patriarchy runs deep. So I think where men are disempowered in communities where they have no jobs, no work, no power, they beat their wives, their kids. They have to show that they are powerful. And so domestic abuse and violence in the home is a pandemic, is an absolute pandemic. So I think so many young women have experienced violence or rape, or they say one in 3 women in South Africa have experienced some kind of sexual abuse, and which is very, very, very high. And so, and the kind of violence that children grow up with. And so when you grow up with violence and you grow up with abnormal home life where you don't have a present father or alcoholism is rife, you have dysfunctional young people who have lost a sense of their humanity and their ability to aspire. And so I think the youth in South Africa, and Black youth particularly, it's very challenging in terms of how to find an identity to be able to overcome all of this violence. So yeah, it's a very big issue. For me, in my little corner, art can do a lot. We've just started last year the very first art therapy program in Africa in the university. There's been no qualifications in art therapy, and yet it's the one discipline that I believe that could really make a difference in the lives of trauma, that so many of our children suffer trauma. And art therapy is so powerful and effective in addressing trauma in kids. And so, yeah, so I think Yeah, I'm not sure where I was going with this, but I just think that being an artist or being able to teach art or creative ways of healing or healing oneself or dealing with trauma through a language that is common, like a visual language that kids can express themselves or adults can express themselves visually that they can't through language or through words or because of the trauma. I think it's very powerful, symbol and metaphor and making something, aesthetics. All of that is a very powerful antidote to kind of dealing with and overcoming trauma, I think, or using art to help you through trauma. So yes, I think violence is a big question and something we have to respond to. So we just did a project with called the Lockdown Collection over lockdown. It's a year, I think, this week that we were in lockdown, and we did a number of portfolios, but our artist proof student studio kids. I mean, the stories of these young people are quite terrifying, and yet they carry on. Yet they're there. They show up. They're so determined, and they have to succeed and overcome because what other choices do they have? And so and art gives them a language, and the ability to be somebody.
South Africa is not monocultural. Arguably no society is monocultural, but especially South Africa. There's a mix of a bunch of different roots and groups and etc. Um, do you think that art is sort of uniquely important to South Africa or to very mixed societies, like for example the US, also because it is so like culturally universal in a way? Like it's not imposing English or Afrikaans, it's just kind of like it is, and you don't have to necessarily come from a certain like cultural artistic background to participate in it.
Sure, I mean, visual language crosses boundaries and crosses barriers, and that's why it is so powerful. But it's what a kind of Western idea of art is very different to an African idea of art, and rural cultural traditions are not always compatible with Western white traditions, and so how we use art and how art can be used or artistic practice or ritual. I don't even think there's a word for art in some languages, in African languages. So it's a different because it's art means artifice in from a Western kind of culture, whereas it's very much intrinsic to, to the original um, indigenous people. I mean, the Bushmen San people who painted on rock art thousands and thousands of years. That is about summoning up the ancestors. That was an act of, absolute belief systems and ritual. It's very intrinsic to the very nature of of making art. It's much more powerful then than it is on a gallery wall to see it in on a cave in a painting where it has a power beyond itself and beyond what we know. So I think it's yeah, but the language is there. We can read it across all the diversity of cultures and languages. So I think yeah, it has of course it's a unifying language for the world.
I have this quote that I pulled that I've been asking everybody that I talk to just sort of respond to and connect to their own work. And I think it might help you, not like help you, but I could see you kind of like going along this path and maybe kind of like chewing on this more will get more out. But the quote is, The experience of violence creates an experience of unspeakable depths. Words alone attend to only a small portion of the deeper process. I don't know. I don't know what my question really is. I'm just like, what do you think of that?
I mean, I think I'm learning a lot more about it through sort of convening this art therapy program and hearing other art therapists talk about how art can reach deeper places where words cannot and trauma cannot. And it's an amazing thing. I mean, I'm learning a lot about art and therapy, and I think that I think he might have also been talking about a kind of about self-respect and value, and how do you value yourself to be able to feel a sense of self and purpose, and to be able to imagine your way out of the depths of despair or loss, and I think working through materials, working through symbols, working through metaphors to allow you to reach places that words can't reach. And I think materials have a power in themselves. If you talk about an object and what an object represents, and that's how we kind of used the paper prayers, is that this object is this. It represents this for me. And being able to verbalize this fence, or this impression of a fence, is linked of a chain and holds us together as a community, or symbols like that, I think are so powerful. And it really, and some rural women said this idea that paper can pray, the idea of paper prayers, and who was making paper, and that once they recognized that you can pray through your paper, through your work, this idea that the making gives you a sense of hope and imagination, helps you get through places that words don't. And I think that is quite a profound understanding of the power of aesthetics, of poetry, of dance, where words cannot reach, but expression and creativity can.
In a more structural sense, just like what power does art have to you to really contribute to that activism and that social change?
Well, I think through Artist Proof Studio, we've done a number of campaigns. The first big one was HIV and AIDS. When I was in Boston, AIDS was a big issue. And then when I moved back to South Africa, this whole fight for democracy and the policies around the struggle of a transitional government, AIDS sort of got pushed on the back burner. And suddenly we had this pandemic where hundreds of thousands of people were dying. And we had a president after Mandela, Thabo Mbeki, who was an AIDS denialist, which meant that he actually discounted antiretrovirals to be accessible for common people. And so it is equivalent to a genocide. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people died. So there was this huge stigma around AIDS. And if you were sick, it was a death sentence because you couldn't get access to antiretrovirals. I mean, the reason I was late today, I was watching the president make another announcement about the COVID pandemic and closing things down for Easter, because, South Africa's got a terrible, terrible history of health and abuse and corruption and all of that. But the AIDS issue was devastating, and so we embarked on a campaign, also one that I heard of in Boston, called the Paper Prayers campaign. And paper prayers means you make an artwork for healing and well-being. And that's believing in the intrinsic healing power of art. But so the idea was that I took all my students and we went around the country doing workshops with HIV activists and health practitioners, teaching about protection, testing, and using arts and using paper prayers as a means to break the silence around HIV and break the stigma. And in fact, for my PhD, I actually ended up doing a research project where I got Ford Foundation funding to try and track and monitor how art can save lives through this paper prayers campaign, through other campaigns. And so this idea of can art save lives and how can it save lives was something I was investigating for my own research. So this campaign was a very effective campaign, but it was a methodology around, so using art as a methodology for social change became one of the sort of areas of my own research, and I've been looking at that since. So I think there are many strategies for change. In fact, I wrote my book. I don't know where it is, called Finding Voice. It was based on my thesis. So it kind of looked at different strategies for change. So one was this paper prayers campaign. One was poverty alleviation when we started this Humani Paper, which is a paper-making collectives all over the country where government funded the university to do small enterprises. So looking at art and crafts and teaching people crafts to be self-sufficient and break the cycle of poverty. And then another cycle, another project was looking at this cultural action for social change, where I involved students as activists to kind of work on some of these campaigns. And so I think when you ask a question, what is it about art? Well, I try and write about that a bit, but the idea about the link to imagination and agency. So making something gives you the power to imagine. And I think artists can help non-artists and community members imagine what is possible and try and visualize. So it's about a kind of ability to aspire for something better and visualize. And I think it's linked to an agency to take power for yourself in your own life. And making something of value is very empowering. So when people make artwork, it's a very powerful kind of self-affirming act that does make a difference. So yeah, so that's in many ways art is that. And then art is also, in our context at Art is Proof and where I teach at the university, art also gives people the ability to be, self-agent, self-sufficient, self-sustainable, and how they can, see themselves as actors in the world and not victims.
What is the piece that you dream of in South Africa resulting from art and the work of art? Like, why do you do what you do, I guess? What do you want to come from it?
Well, I think my latest sort of mission is to get art therapy established in South Africa. So, and I believe that there's a huge role for art therapy because it's a different role of art than art as art. So I think Artist Proof Studio is, many artists who have become very successful, who are making a lot of money, who are giving back to the community. In that way, that cycle is happening, and we understand the value and the power of helping young people reach their dreams and make a difference and actually make a living and do incredibly well. And it's extraordinary how many young people have found a place. It's just South Africa's sort of had a renaissance of artists, young black artists, just coming to the fore and being incredibly sought after. And so that there's that, and that is a dream to continue that dream for many young artists to be able to do that without having to go through university that they cannot afford. So that is that, have that dream continue, and the other is to have the dream of growing the sector around. So there's this creative economy of like thinking about, even over lockdown, how it was the arts that kind of kept us all going. Everybody was locked up, and what did everybody do but listen to music, go online, read theater, read books? It's that kept the soul alive, that kept you vital, that kept you from sinking into the depths. And the hope is that period where we were in that kind of cocoon, that people recognize the value of arts and provide more agency. I was on a Zoom call this afternoon with somebody from the World Health Organization on art and health, and this woman who's in Switzerland, who has this kind of vision of bringing best practices around the globe, where arts have made a huge difference to communities in Brazil, in all over the place, and she wants to pull this whole network together around best practices. And I must send you as soon as she pulls this together. But she said she wants to do this exhibition at the World Health Organization and bring this to the fore. And I think that's a huge vision, and it's very realistic. And I think the fact that it came out of COVID and the recognition that this is one of the most powerful mediums to make change is so fantastic, that this person has just adopted this, and she's determined and obviously very connected. She's a doctor and a health practitioner and worked all over Africa, and has clearly the connections and the power. But she's going to do a webinar, and she's going to then do this huge exhibition on the 15th of June in Switzerland, in Davos. I think it's great, to make those connections, those global connections. So that's thinking big, and it's thinking globally, and that's great. And it'd be great to have a footprint on that. Another thing is I got invited to present the portfolio that the Artist Proof students did on climate change. How do you help policymakers in Canada who are writing policy around climate change think about green renewal, and how do you use art to help them think about a different future? And that's about the power of their imagination. And these youngsters could come up with images that helped a different kind of vision of a green renewal. And the fact is that this professor of law who invited me to present art at this climate change on law policy was quite radical, innovative, but it's a recognition that that's the space that helps people imagine a different universe is possible. So those are some examples.
That makes me very happy to hear. You can find out more about Artist Proof at www.artistproofstudio.co.za. Kim also has a book titled Finding Voice, A Visual Approach to Engaging Change, published by the University of Michigan Press. Thanks for listening. This podcast is being counted towards completion of a PEAC 250H independent study credit at Wellesley College. Thank you to my advisor, Professor Nadya Hajj, the Peace and Justice Studies Department, and thank you once again to Kim Berman for volunteering her time on this project.